Okay, now I will proceed to talk about another kind of environmental inequalities, which is global waste trade and toxic dumping. So, for example, United States has 5% of world populations, but it produces 19% of global waste. And residents of the richest countries produce 1,763 pounds of waste per year compared to less than 440 pounds in the poorest country. So we all know that the rich consume more and therefore they have more waste. And one more thing is the success of environmental movement in the US or in the West in general actually provides incentives to export waste to the other countries. So the global waste trade is somehow like the spatial fix as well. So people actually treat waste too. Like when it becomes too costly to throw something in the United States, people will try to export it elsewhere. And so I have also asked you to look at a web documentary on e-waste in Ghana. And we are all guilty of e-waste, right? You can think about when is the last time you change your phone, when is the last time you change your laptop. It is so essential in our daily lives, and e-waste actually become itself an own category of waste. So this country generate the most electronic waste. From Statista, I got this statistics. Actually, China has been generating the most, but if you look at per capita, it's not that much. It's 4.2 kilogram per capita, and United States has the 19.4 kilogram per capita, and the highest is actually by 22.8 by Germany. Germany has highest per capita, followed by France, and then by United States, and then Italy. The smallest here is actually India. Even though India is like the so-called IT countries, but it is highly uneven. So per capita wise, it is really small. So this is also something I quoted from the web documentary by a local environmental activist in Ghana. It used to be an amazing wetland, a beautiful paradise. So this is the pictures that's in Accra, Ghana. And then these are actually pictures in China where they are garbage being imported at the port. And then stop liners, Malaysians don't want Australian toxic waste. This is from my very own home country. A few years back, there have been this movement because local populations heard that the Linus company, which is an Australian-based company, are going to dump their waste in Malaysia. And actually, Linus is producing rare earth material, and rare earth material is kind of essential for electronics, but they're also very toxic. So the Malaysians don't want them to dump it here. As Malaysians themselves might be using the products of those rare earth as well. And this is hidden when you just look at the factories that produce it. Okay, so, and of course, countries, as they develop, they also fight back. They don't want people's garbage. So Malaysians send 4,120 tons of plastic trash back to 13 rich country, saying it refuses to be the rubbish dump of the world. So this is very recent, in general, January 21 this year. And then we also have China banning their plastic waste import. So how China's plastic waste ban forced a global recycling reckoning. The country once imported nearly half of the planet's plastic recyclables. Now the world is scrambling to adjust. So the third kind of environmental inequalities between countries is climate injustice. I think climate change is a hot topic today, and you might have known about this debate about richer countries having been primarily responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, but the poorer countries are actually more vulnerable to the impact of climate change. So climate change will increase frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and hazards and affects agriculture around the world, even though actually in some areas such as temperate area, it is believed to actually enhance agriculture, but not in the other areas such as dry areas or the tropical regions. And then sea level rise might submerge small island states and coastal areas such as Tuvalu and Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a big coastal populations. It itself is a highly populated country with high population density. And then we have also glacial lake outburst flood risk in mountainous areas such as in the Himalaya regions. And then poorer countries have less capacities to respond to climate change and related natural disaster. And you can see that people are moving away due to floods in this picture. And then they're Pacific Islander telling that we are not drowning, we are fighting, right? Okay. And then which country are most in danger from rising sea levels? I found this, so I share it here. It seems like if you look at the countries here, it seems like a majority of this country is actually located in Asia. So in China, if it's a 3-degree country, 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, it will be 64 million people being affected by rising sea level. Or 145 million if it is 4 degrees Celsius. Sorry, this is 2 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius. So it is a huge difference, more than double the figure of people affected. And that is not very surprising that China has big cities located in the coastal areas such as Shanghai. So is India. India is the second biggest, and then Bangladesh, and then Vietnam. But United States is actually here too, right? United States has a lot of coastal city as well. And Egypt has Alexandria, the port city. Okay, and so these are also some recent news that I'm showing with you. The latest UN ruling is a step towards improving the lives of those most vulnerable and affected by climate change. Oh, interesting. What is the ruling about? Okay. The recent ruling by the United Nations that governments cannot return people to countries where their lives might be threatened by climate change is a potential game changer, not just for climate refugees, but also for global climate actions. So this is in January 2020. Apparently, UN has a ruling that climate refugees are refugees who cannot return them to their original place. And this is a picture of Kiribati Islands, where people are already forced to relocate due to the effects of coastal erosions and saltwater intrusions. Well, this seems like a good news, right? Apart that the UN is not really able to enforce rules to be followed by countries worldwide. So you can see here immediately in February, this year, Germany says it will not grant asylum to climate refugees, right? So now I will talk about environmental inequalities within countries. And of course, it's not that simple. Sometimes environmental inequalities within countries is entangled with the global unequal exchange, right? But for now, let's look at environmental racism or environmental classism, right? So socially marginalized racial minorities or poor communities subjected to disproportionate exposure of pollutants, the denial of access to ecological benefits, or both. This is what is being called environmental racism or environmental classism. So actually, environmentalism in general has contributed to environmental racism. So what do I mean by that? This idea is mainly I've taken from a scholar called Bullitt. He wrote this in the 1960s when there is middle class environmentalism rising in the United States. Investors and government become more careful when they talk about putting some hazardous toxic waste sites in this middle class area. And actually that has pushed the concentration of environmental hazards in minorities neighborhoods or poor neighborhood because they have less power and less voices to be heard by others. So some people also call this kind of environmentalism as NIMBY, NIMBY, which basically is an abbreviation of not in my backyard. So don't throw the garbage in my backyard, but I don't really care where this goes to, and it doesn't really affect my own consumptions level, which is actually what I felt with the Linus protests in Malaysia that I just talked to you about in last part of the lecture, because I feel Malaysians are heavy electronic products users, but they did not associate that with the waste facilities by Linus as a rare earth company. So environmentalism has contributed to environmental racism and environmental classism, right? And then, of course, again, even within the same countries, poor communities and minorities might face disproportionate impact by climate change, simply because they might not have the abilities to either move or have the resources to deal with the impact of climate change. So, in one of your readings, I asked you to look at a video on Flint water crisis that is in the United States. And then before this, in our earlier lectures, we talk about how Katrina in New Orleans has actually disproportionately affected African American neighborhoods. And then we also talk about Argentina shantytown. Urban slum dwellers are having really bad sanitary conditions and have bad environmental conditions, have higher proportions of diseases. These are all sort of manifestations of environmental classism or environmental racism. I'm sure some of you are really familiar with the Flint water crisis because it is a big deal. But for those of you who are not, there is actually a film, an excellent film being made about Flint. So you can check this movie out. I actually watched this movie in a flight, so they're available on flights too. And then also, if you want to know much more about Hurricane Katrina and its disproportionate impact on African Americans communities, you can look at Desire and Disaster in New Orleans. Okay, so apart from classisms and racisms, we also have these geographical factors. So we have these urban-rural environmental inequalities, right? So urban areas usually obtain food and energy from rural areas and return waste to them. This is almost similar with how core countries obtain food and energy from peripheral countries and return waste to them. So it's sort of like a similar kind of relationship. And this is logical because when you look back to the world system theory, it doesn't only say that only countries can be core or countries can be peripheral. Actually, within countries, you would have core areas and peripheral areas as well. So examples here are like herbicides and fertilizers used for food production will degrade health, land, and water resources in rural areas. So we all eat something that comes from the rural area, but we do not suffer as much from the herbicides and fertilizer use of these food productions. And then pollutants from CAFO. CAFO means confined animal feeding operations, I believe. You can find in rural parts in Wisconsin, and then the smell can be pretty bad. I used to visit one of them. Some of the owners install facilities to diffuse the smell, but it still can be pretty bad even so. And then the sewage of the animals is a lot, especially when you're talking about thousands of animals. And then we have hydropower projects, nuclear reactors, and solid waste dumps, usually located in rural areas that deteriorates people's health, livelihood, and property values. So typically, hydropower projects will not be built in the middle of the city. So are nuclear reactors or solid waste dumps. They are often in sparse populated areas. But even so, those sparsely populated areas still have people. And they need to be relocated and compensated, but that's not always possible, right? And rural and indigenous people displaced due to logging, hydropower, and other extraction projects. So if you pay attention to the news, even though they are not sufficiently covered at all, but you can see there are indigenous people struggling worldwide, being displaced by economic activities, such as in the Amazons. They have been very vocal protesting logging in their areas, but so are indigenous people in Malaysia. But if you look at Malaysian news, you hardly see any coverage of that at all, due to self-censorship or simply due to the negligence of people with little power. And of course, these economic projects and extraction projects sometimes support international markets. So this is the urban rural environmental inequalities. So this is an article that I would recommend you to read because it is easy for a non-academic reader as well. It's by Reeve and Wink, Urban Rural Exploitation and Underappreciated Dimension of Environmental Injustice. And they look at two specific examples, industrial hog productions in eastern North Carolina and Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in Japan. And these two people are actually working in public health. You can see they are from the Department of Epidemiology. So, but they saw this environmental injustice that they want to write an article about. And it's published in Journal of Rural Studies, which is usually a sociology journal.